So let's keep digging into this, because this is quite fascinating work. This is data from Mike Price, or information from Mike Price, who takes this all a stage further for us. And he's written this: complete transection of the spinal cord results in the altered control of a number of physiological mechanisms, including thermoregulation. And we've not addressed this yet, but we've kind of alluded to it. More specifically, there is a reduced afferent input to the thermoregulatory centre and a disruption of both vasomotor control and sweating capacity below the level of the spinal cord lesion. As the level of the spinal cord lesion increases, the area of sensate skin decreases, with both the afferent information regarding the thermal state of the body and the efferent response being reduced. Consequently, those subjects with thoracic spinal cord injuries, the paraplegic individuals, possess greater amounts of afferent and efferent information than those with cervical spinal cord injuries, the tetraplegic individuals. So what Mike is getting at here is that there's a significant impact on our ability to thermoregulate depending upon the height of the spinal cord injury. And this is both in terms of the ability to dissipate heat from the body, it's the ability to move heat from the core to the periphery, but also fundamentally, because you've got the change in the afferent and the efferent signals, there is now a direct effect on the sensation of the change in temperature. We respond to changes in core temperature, and that affects what we do in terms of our physical activity. But if you're not getting those inputs coming in because of the spinal cord damage, the ability to respond is diminished. And he goes on to write this: these individuals demonstrate a loss or reduction in sweating capacity and an inability to make vasomotor adjustments below the level of the spinal cord lesion. Considering that sweating and blood redistribution are the two main thermoregulatory effectors, and that sweat gland dysfunction is a risk factor for heat injury, it stands to reason that this population may demonstrate thermal imbalance and a greater risk of heat injury than the able-bodied. So fundamentally, because you've lost that neural control, you've lost the ability to regulate temperature. Remember that everything is neurally controlled. So if you can't now move blood, remember we talked about the notion of you're below the spinal cord injury, the ability to redirect blood is diminished. And the fundamental way that we redirect blood for thermoregulation is we direct it to the skin. So if you've got a significant spinal cord injury, you've lost that ability below the lesion to move any blood flow to the skin to release heat. But the same is also true in terms of trying to maintain heat or retain heat. Moving anything from below the spinal cord injury to the core is also reduced. And then that is coupled with, as I've mentioned on the previous panel, with a loss in terms of the sensation to the changing in the heat absorbency. So here we've got a great example of this. Here you've got able-bodied athletes and those with a spinal cord injury. We've got environmental temperatures on our x-axis, and then we've got sweat rate on our y-axis. And what you can see in the able-bodied athletes is their sweat rate, not surprisingly, increases with environmental temperature, as do those of the spinal cord injury athletes. But the key thing is, look at the amount of sweat that they are dissipating. And actually what you see is that the steepness is nowhere near as significant as it is in the able-bodied athletes. So at around about environmental temperature of 15 degrees C, they've both got between about 0.3 and 0.4 litres per minute. But by the time we get to 40 degrees C, the spinal cord injury athlete is about 1 litre compared to 1.6 litres in the able-bodied athlete. And the sweating is kind of the second part of this process in terms of dissipating heat. We talked about redistribution of blood flow, but fundamentally the sweat response is a significant way in which heat is ejected from the body. But if the sweat rate is reduced, then the core temperature will rise because you've got no way of dissipating the heat. Now, there is a counter argument to that, which is, well, fundamentally the sweat rate is also a function of the degree of the active muscle mass. So the spinally cord injured athlete will have a lower active muscle mass compared to the able-bodied athlete, which is absolutely correct, but they have a reduced ability, irrespective of that, to dissipate the heat. That therefore increases the thermoregulatory strain, and because they're not picking up on those sensations, they're not then able to make conscious decisions in terms of regulating effort. So this is some more data from Mike Price's group. So what they've got is 3 categories of athletes here. So they've got 3 groups. So the TPs are kind of the tetraplegic based athletes, and then the HPs and the LPs. So the HPs are kind of thoracic region, kind of 1 to 5, 1 to 6. So the HP are kind of 1 to 6, and then the LP are kind of going from 6 to about 10 in the thoracic region. So in other words, the TPs are the more spinally cord, have the more severe spinal cord injury. HP are within the middle, and the low LP have the lowest level of spinal cord injury. And what they've done here is 60 minutes of continuous based exercise, and then they've recorded their rating of perceived exertion. And this is important in understanding what we were referring to in the previous panel in terms of the thermoregulatory mechanisms and the sensations to stop. They're all working, now they're all working at the same kind of relative exercise intensity, but of course they're all doing different amounts of work because of the spinal cord injury. But look at the difference. Those with a higher spinal cord injury have a lower rating of perceived exertion across all time points. Across the early time point, the athletes who have kind of got the higher thoracic injury, the HPs, and those with the lower thoracic injury have very, very similar sensations. But as we start to increase the duration, those with the lower spinal cord injury, who have got therefore a greater undamaged neural network, are able to perceive more precisely the intensity of the exercise and the effort that they are undergoing than the other groups. And this is really important because it means that they're able to then make important adjustments in terms of exercise, but also important decisions about whether they need to terminate exercise. That has ramifications, particularly when you've got athletes with spinal cord injuries exercising or racing or competing in environments with very high temperatures. So if we then go on a little bit and we kind of look at this data in a little bit more. So what they've got here is they've got the exercise blocks. This is the same paper. What they've got is they've recorded temperatures, which is oral temperature, and they've also recorded it on the back in our 3 groups of athletes. So here you've got it at rest. Now it's interesting, if you look at rest in the oral temperature here, you can see that fundamentally it's the tetraplegics have lower temperatures than the other 2 groups. But as we start to exercise, look what happens. The tetraplegic athlete, despite the fact that they have got a lower active muscle mass, have a higher oral temperature than the other 2 groups. The other 2 groups are pretty similar. When we go to recovery, the dissipation of heat and the lowering of the heat response is almost identical for those with thoracic injuries, and the rate of decrease. The rate of decrease, remember they started from a higher core temperature anyway, but the rate of decrease for the thoracically impaired athlete is significantly reduced. Why? Because they've got a lower active muscle mass available for heat dissipation. They've got a lower active muscle mass available for heat dissipation and a lower active skin mass for active heat dissipation. Therefore, their core temperature rises. If we then look at the back, we see the same effect with the back. So the back is perhaps a better way of understanding this. But as soon as we get to the onset of exercise, the athlete with the cervical spinal cord injury has a significant rise in that temperature compared to the other 2 groups who have got the thoracic injury. Remember, a lower spinal cord injury. So they are not only unable to dissipate the heat because the temperature is rising and they're all doing the same block of work, they're unable to sense that the temperature is rising. Remember, the RPE scores were lower across the same period of work in the tetraplegics compared to our paraplegic based athletes. So you've kind of got this confluence because they've lost the sensation and they've lost the thermoregulatory mechanisms for heat dissipation. So you get to this point where their thermoregulatory strain increases in the tetraplegics far more than it does in the paraplegic athlete. Okay, so what we've got is we've got the data at different regions of the body. So we've got the forearm temperature, we've got temperature on the chest, we've got temperature on the calf, and then we've got oral temperature here, which has been taken perhaps less frequency. The others would be using IMU based data. And as I say, what we've got is we've got the data split into our two primary population groups, able-bodied and spinal cord injured athletes. So what I want to focus on is where they've had no fluid. So I want to focus on the triangles and the solid squares. So if you look at the triangles and the solid squares and you compare, in this case, let's look at forearm. So what you can see is the forearm temperature in our spinal cord lesion athletes is a lot lower than it is in our able-bodied athletes. Okay, so I'll start again. So what I want to focus on is I want to look at our able-bodied versus our spinal cord lesion athletes. But what I want to look at is where there's no fluid being given to them. So in our solid triangles and in our solid squares. So if we look in our forearm, you can see here quite clearly that no fluid replacement on the forearm in our able-bodied athletes results in a higher temperature of the forearm than it does in our spinal cord lesion athletes. If we then look at something like the calf muscle, so in the calf muscle, here's our able-bodied athletes, here's our spinal cord lesion athletes. And the same if we look at the chest, you see exactly the same response. It's interesting that the spinal cord lesion athletes show a progressive increase and our able-bodied athletes show a progressive decline. In both groups, you can see the impact that when fluid replacement is given to them, they get a better regulation of temperature. But the fluid replacement bit is a bit of a red herring in our discussions today. Really, the key thing is understanding, well, why is it that the able-bodied athlete has got a higher temperature response across these different regions? And fundamentally, what you're looking at is, remember, it's about active muscle mass. And the active muscle mass is greater in a spinal cord lesion athlete than it will be in an athlete who, active muscle mass will be greater in an able-bodied athlete, than it will be in an athlete with a spinal cord lesion. So, for example, in the calf, there is very little active muscle mass in a spinal cord lesion athlete. So what we have is a situation with these athletes, which is their thermoregulatory responses are acutely different to those who are able-bodied because of the amount of active, blood flow redistribution, that's impaired by the spinal cord lesion, and secondly, the amount of innate skin that can be used for the dissipation of heat. If the amount of skin that's used for the dissipation of heat reduces, you lose that inability to release the heat. So when you have this situation, you think, well, hold on, how does that fit in terms of the argument that you've just made? Well, if you look here, in terms of the calf, they've got a lower active muscle mass. Because the active muscle mass is reduced, then fundamentally there's less heat being generated. There's less heat being generated in the chest region, and because the able-bodied individual is working with a greater overall muscle mass, the forearm temperatures are going to be raised, despite the fact that the spinal cord lesion athlete has probably actually developed quite well the upper body, but a lot of this will depend upon the severity of the spinal cord lesion. If they are getting into kind of upper bands of thoracic and getting into cervical, then this very much plays into that notion of starting to reduce upper body strength and upper body power, and therefore the amount of force that is being generated and the amount of heat that they are fundamentally able to produce. If we then go a little bit further, we get to the notion of heat storage. And this is quite interesting. This relates to that ability. It's the balance between the heat that's being produced and the heat that's being lost. And it's what we call the heat storage capacity. And this is a really nice reflection of this in relation to lesion level. Remember that the amount of heat we produce is a function predominantly of the amount of work that the muscle is doing. So the greater the amount of work a muscle is doing, the more heat one produces for the same relative exercise intensity. But you've also got the fact that we have to dissipate that heat. And so the difference between the heat being produced and the heat being dissipated reflects our heat storage capacity. So although somebody who's got a cervical spinal lesion has a lower active muscle mass and therefore a proportionally lower amount of heat being generated, because they have got a reduced surface area for dissipating that heat, both in skin and also in other like muscle tissue, their heat storage goes up. They're storing more heat. And as you move further down the spinal column, you start to see that the storage, the amount of heat they store, is reduced. So you get that kind of positive skew on that relationship. And Mike Price goes on to write this from another paper, which is, he talks about lower, so this is athletes who've got a lower spinal cord injury. Athletes demonstrated an earlier increase in oral temperature during exercise when compared with the tetraplegic. Those are the athletes with the cervical spinal injury, and even those who are kind of the mid-thoracic, the HP athletes. This is most likely due to the greater recruitable muscle mass, which we've already referred to, and absolute metabolic heat production of these athletes because they've got a greater active muscle mass. However, by 20 minutes of exercise, similar increases in oral temperature were observed for all groups. After this point, oral temperatures for the HP and the LP athletes increased at much lower rates when compared with the TP athletes. Again, fundamentally reflecting what we were referring to in terms of all of these athletes will have diminished temperature responses compared to the able-bodied athlete because of the active muscle mass, but the amount of heat that they're able to dissipate is a function also of the height of the spinal cord lesion, and therefore you get that kind of knock-on effect in terms of the heat storage capacity. And he goes on to write this: the gradual increase in oral temperature indicates that although the HP and the LP athletes were not able to dissipate heat as quickly as it was gained, the cooling mechanisms initiated by these groups were more effective than for the TP group. The greater and continued increase in the oral temperature for the TP group is most likely to be due to the loss of evaporative cooling and effective heat dissipation observed in this population. Now, we've not talked about evaporative cooling, but we've kind of alluded to it. Evaporative cooling is the notion of the sweat-based response and then the dissipating of the heat from the skin. Remember that what we've been suggesting is, if you have a high spinal cord injury lesion, then you've got less active skin for cooling. It means you've got less active skin for the process of the sweat response, and therefore less capacity to dissipate that heat to the surrounding environment. And as we come further down the spinal cord lesion, we have a greater innate skin surface area, and therefore can dissipate more heat through the process of evaporation.